And one of the things that was most amazing as we were doing this was that I heard a woman say, they must be actors because they're too young to be soldiers. How disconnected are the American people from what's happening in Iraq right now? New York City wasn't the only place we did it. We did it all across the country. Of course, I didn't personally participate in every one. Soldiers did it from their local area. But we've also testified before Congress. We've also led anti-war protests. We've also encouraged the appeal for redress. We've also spoken and organized meetings with our local congressmen. We've also gone to universities, to schools, to churches, to anybody who will hear our story and speak. The nightly news, the newspaper, everything, we've done it. Because we will not stop until this war is over. And even then, we have some business to take care of. So the three demands of Iraq Veterans Against the War are first and foremost the immediate withdrawal of all occupying forces from Iraq. The language we use is very specific. We don't say all American soldiers from Iraq. We say all occupying forces because there are contractors there. You see, there's a private military there that is exploiting the resources of Iraq, who are working personally for members of our government elected by the people. All occupying forces must leave Iraq. Secondly, reparations for the Iraqi people. When we were there, it was quite evident that this was a war on the Iraqi people. Of course, to exploit the resources of Iraq, but at the cost of the Iraqi people, not some nebulous regime or some terrorists that were hiding in obscure parts of Iraq. It was a war on the Iraqi people because it just seemed that they got in the way of certain people's plans to exploit their resources. So they had to be dealt with. Well, we can't forget that. And what's right is right. And so we cannot abandon the Iraqi people. We don't want to be there, right, occupying them. We want our forces to leave because that's the problem. But we will never forget our commitment to them, for the justice that we owe them, for the generations that will suffer from this war. They have not yet begun to feel the full consequences of this conflict, believe me. So we owe them. And so that's a serious demand of Iraq Veterans Against the War. And third, a comprehensive care plan for veterans. This is the worst generation of veterans to be cared for. Worse than the Vietnam veterans, if you can believe that. Because they were treated horribly. Housing, education, and health care are three things that every soldier coming home should get. I served in Iraq. I cannot go to the VA for medical treatment if I need to. My grandfather served in the Second World War. Now he can. But our generation, it was cut from lifetime benefits to 2 years. You get 2 years. Never mind that post-traumatic stress disorder in many cases doesn't set in for 10, 15, 20 years. But you can't claim it at that point. About money for college, where you get what you get, $7,000, that's what I got. That's nothing today. And that was before the war started. When these soldiers go to war and they become combat veterans, the government owes them money for college. They should get money for college and housing. There's already over 600 homeless veterans from the Iraq War. It's going to go up because sometimes people can't deal with the experiences that they had because it damages the soul. And so the government must provide an outlet for these soldiers who cannot provide for themselves. And decent housing. Now, my service in Iraq, I served in the first year of the war, 2003, 2004, and I actually crossed into Iraq the very first day of the ground war. I was attached officially to the 3rd Infantry Division, as Matthew said, as a combat engineer. With the 3rd day of the war, I was transferred to the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and actually went in the invasion with the Marine Corps and entered into Baghdad from the east side. I stayed in Baghdad for a month, attempted to quell the looting and the chaos that was going there, and then moved to Al-Anbar province for 6 months, where I finished my tour in Balad, Iraq, the final 3 months. When we enlisted in the military, of course there are many different reasons why people do enlist in the military, and we can't really talk about that on a broad level. Of course, economics are a very huge part of that. But personally, I had this view of American soldiers, 17 years old, mind you, this view of American soldiers as these knights in shining armor, always out to do the chivalrous thing. And when I first experienced combat, I was shocked to find out that soldiers who grew up not in extraordinarily violent areas. I mean, sure, you have some soldiers coming from some maybe violent areas of the inner city, but nothing like sectarian violence of the Balkans or some parts of Africa or the Middle East, or we can go around the world and talk about some of the violence that occurs. Nothing like that. People that grew up with the Smurfs and the Care Bears and whatever else you could think of. And then to see what happens when young people, conditioned by the military, are put on the streets of a foreign country, a country in which soldiers are led to believe are inhabited by subhuman creatures, and then to see what happens. It was absolutely shocking. How could anybody recover from that? The part of the reason that many soldiers are driven to speak out against this war is because the memory of some of the things that they had seen, or in some instances done, against the Iraqi people compels them to do so. We always imagined that civilian casualties would come from stray bombs, maybe. Somebody who didn't know that they were doing it would be an accident. And then to see what urban combat was like, to see vehicles moving through villages and cities with 50 caliber machine guns, which have no trouble going through walls like this, just tearing villages apart, with blatant disregard for Iraqi human life. And it just got worse, because when the areas were quote-unquote peaceful, soldiers really began to exploit the Iraqi people for all they thought they were worth. Now, there was two competing views in the U.S. military at that time, in the opening days after Saddam's regime fell. And one group thought maybe we could help the Iraqi people. Now, obviously, that's a naive view. You can't help them if you're standing in the streets enforcing military occupation. But you have to understand that if you're at least clinging on to the hope of some type of morality, you would adopt a paradigm like that. That maybe we could do some good for the Iraqi people.